We're following the latest in Nicaragua as the country marks its National Liberation Day. Pro-government paramilitaries have essentially invaded and captured the streets of Masaya. This city has been at the center of the resistance and pro-democracy movement. The U.S., United Nations, and international community are demanding an end to the recent wave of violence that has left hundreds dead.
The new violence has been characterized as an unprecedented bloodbath by observers, and this council cannot ignore it. The United States condemns the ongoing attacks by President Daniel Ortega's para-police forces against university students, journalists, and the clergy across their country.
Well, Univision correspondent Tifani Roberts is with me now. You are in Managua, Nicaragua. Tifani, bring us up to speed. What are the new developments in Nicaragua today? Are protesters retreating from the streets after pro-government forces appear to recapture the city of Masaya earlier this week? And just give me a sense of what's happening.
Well, that city you talk about is very close to Managua, where I'm at, the capital. It's about 13 miles away. And we're in contact with a lot of the kids that were behind the barricades. They were all barricaded for weeks and maybe more than 2.5 months. And as your video showed, paramilitary forces along with police forces came in and cleaned the whole city. The protesters retreated, and there's at least 200 of them trying to get away and trying to find their way, maybe to Costa Rica, maybe to safe houses, or maybe some ranches in the area. And the whole sense is that, you know, they call them Operation Limpieza, which is like they come in and they clean the streets and they arrest hundreds and hundreds of them. So you hear through social media, through phone calls, that people are being arrested. Paramilitaries are knocking down doors and arresting people that they have identified as being part of the protest. So it's a very repressive environment right now. So yesterday with the OAS, there was a ray of hope down here that at least the international community knew what was going on, that they were aware, and the sanctions promised by some Congress members of Congress in Washington also are seen here as hope that, you know, the international community is not turning their back on Nicaragua.
About these sanctions against the government, do you think they will have the impact that you hope? You know, often when there are sanctions, what ends up happening is the people are the ones that find themselves the most victimized by those sanctions as opposed to the government. I know, you know, the economy has already sort of fallen apart here. But tell me why you think sanctions would work.
Because the sanctions are not the typical sanctions like that we've known when they did it with Cuba and other communist governments. These sanctions, for example, a couple of weeks ago, the Magnitsky Act, I have a problem pronouncing that, was applied to 3 top government officials, including the chief of the police, that they're being accused of extrajudicial assassination. So those are targeted sanctions towards the government and the people that are committing these assassinations, basically, and that are you know, responsible for these paramilitary forces out on the street.
You talked about sort of this idea of this clean sweep and paramilitary forces knocking on doors, looking for people who participated in the protest. I imagine that also means that there are people who have not participated in any of these protests that find themselves getting swept up as well.
Yes, but Nicaragua is a small country. I mean, it's only 6 million inhabitants, and Masaya, even though it's 300,000 people in that city, the town where all these protests were happening, they're very close-knit communities. So everybody knows everybody. We were there yesterday, the day after basically the taking over of the city. And my experience has been in other countries that you go in and people are afraid to talk, and that was not the case. I mean, everybody was wanting to talk on the microphone, giving their faces, telling us how upset they were, and everybody we talked to knew of somebody, either a relative or a neighbor, that had been taken. So there's a lot of anger underneath all that calmness you see on the streets right now.
I find that very interesting. Did you get from that these are people who are not going to back down?
Absolutely. You know, I compare it a little bit like, you know, pimples on a teenager. You know, you can take care of a pimple and then the next one pops up. There's always, we're hearing reports of, you know, other barricades and other little pockets of protests that are happening all over the country. So yes, they have been able to clean the streets and bring in, you know, big numbers of military, but the students are still outraged, and there are a lot of sectors and campesinos, and just there's too many. There's too much anger and disappointment, and it's not going to go away.
So if the protesters aren't backing down, and President Ortega and the paramilitary groups are not backing down, then where do you see this going from here? How do we reach some sort of peace?
That's a good question. And the church, the Catholic Church, and the bishops are trying to set up, well, they've been talking in negotiating tables called the National Dialogue, and they haven't gotten far. But with all this international pressure, they're hoping to go back to the negotiating table and try to pressure Ortega into agreeing to early elections in March of next year. So it's all going to be up to, you know, doing a lot of, I don't know, politicking pressure, going back on the streets. I'm sure there's some kind of plan that they have, but there's too much, how do I call it? I don't know, just, there's not going back. There's no work here. 6 o'clock, everybody, there's no martial law, but nobody goes out at night. There's no business. There's no nightlife. There's shooting at night. It's just, you can't go back to normal. So there has to be a way to come out of this crisis and just try to get this country back on track.
Right. Tifani Roberts in Nicaragua. Thank you so much, Tifani.
You're welcome.